The Barmah River red gum forest is the largest river red gum forest left anywhere in the world. It has supported many associated farming and timber industries over a number of decades and holds within its boundaries an important cultural heritage story. There are many oral histories, as told over several generations from the men and women who were associated with it. The following opinions and recollections are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent the opinion of Moira Shire.
How old would the oldest tree be out there?
Oh, the oldest one I know of posted is about 5.5 metres across in width. So it's probably, towards a couple of thousand. If it can talk, it'd tell some stories.
If Only the Trees Could Talk is a collection of some of these stories, told by those who lived and worked in the forest.
My first recollection of the Barmah Forest was going out with my dad out fishing on the banks of the river out at the old Yellama Station, which was owned by Newmans then. George Newman and his sons Peter and Greg. And I used to camp in the cottage every fortnight there with Dad and Doc Harbison. Doc Harbison would be out there every fortnight. And we'd go fishing, and they would go do a bit of poaching as well, and be sent off with a spinner. I used to fish around the old Alexander Arbuthnot, which was a paddle steamer that had actually sunk there, I think in the 1940s or something. So I lived out there in a tent and a hammock for a fair while. Sometimes I'd run out of food and have to go and shoot a duck or a rabbit. That was it. To me, when the Barmah Forest is in flood, there's no better place on earth to be.
My father, when he came back from the war, had this little farm, about 150 acres, and it butted onto the forest. So I lived along the forest. That was our outlet on push bikes or walking. You'd carry rabbits, walk 2 or 3 miles carrying rabbits. We made our own fun. We enjoyed our own company as kids, and you went the hard way around by making a shilling out of rabbit skins and whatever skins you could get, possums, water rats. Nowadays, you wouldn't have it. You get shot if you caught a water rat. And there was a couple of families that lived on the river down the back of our place. And Mum used to give them homemade butter and eggs and, that sort of stuff. And they were all good people.
Oh, well, the first memories with family, when I was quite young, we were out there with my old Uncle Huey, who practically lived out there. He worked there and spent a lot of time fishing and shooting and poaching and doing all sorts of things. We stayed with him for a week, and he had an old tram, an old Melbourne tram decked out as a sort of a caravan there. It was at Chalker's place, right there near the lakes on the creek.
When Dad was working in the forest, going out there with him and fishing and shooting and, working with him on weekends and during school holidays.
And I sort of vaguely knew there was a forest because I had a friend who used to go out to the bush, and I was always wondering what this mad bush place was, because not having a car or a telephone, you just lived your little insular life. Anyway, I soon found out where the forest was when I started working out at Barmah. Some of the girls from Cumra, they took me out. I sort of got to know the river then in the bush, and they had all these wonderful stories about it and where you could get some fish and so on.
My grandfather, where we were sort of reared down at the grandfather's property, W.B. Sutton, that he actually rode the horse and delivered the mail in the early days. They had the property right next to the Barmah Forest. And then I remember the Jimmy Morgan's sawmill. I can remember as a kid, you'd hear the motor going, especially in the autumn when you get that real quiet sort of time and no wind and the heavy dew sort of thing. you'd hear the old motor thumping. And I remember going around with the old grandfather and getting a load of red gum droppers. And from around there, there was some blokes from Numurkah, I think, finished up running it. I think it might have been Leno Dwyer had something to do with it. Milton's Mill.
I was 5 or 6 years old at school, and one morning Dad said, would you like to have some of the day off school and help us out in the forest? So of course, yeah.
As far back as I can remember, like at state school, well, I was in grade 3, I think, when I used to stay home to load the public works trucks so the old man could stay in the bush. They'd turn up, I'd walk back from school, load the poles in the yard, and then, yeah, it was either that or Dad, as you were saying, from state school, it was, oh, we need a hand to Murray, you better come out and drive the truck for us, or the crane, or whatever.
Jerry had the sawmill at Barmah, of course.
Dad and Jerry, they both started that in the very early 60s, I think it was.
Yeah.
And previous to that, they spent approximately 2 years working on my grandfather's farm, cutting timber in a small spot mill they set up.
All my family worked there. Yeah, old Dad and brothers, and they all worked there. Everybody worked there, didn't they, in those days? When our kids were young, and Lou's kids and the Henny kids, there were so many kids, and they had a wonderful life, really.
I first moved here with my parents in 1966. Dad was the district forest officer, and my involvement with Barmah probably hasn't ceased as yet. Even though I did have a stint in Melbourne, I still come back in the 70s for the muster and for weekend camping trips.
As far as mustering, 1971, as far as I can remember, because of my call when we were always interested in horses and that. And he said, oh, you might as well come out. So I had a pony, and anyway, she went lame, so I ended up with the borrow horses, and that wasn't real good. Ended up with Baxter's mare, and she was that fat she could hardly run. So after that I said, right, get my own.
About 1985, when I was about 10-year-old, Tam started mustering out there with Dad. That was the first time I done the full week. I think I might have rode a day or two prior to that, a couple of years before I used to go out. But yeah, it was about 85 when I started mustering out there. I think it was about 4 years later I became a cattleman. Got my own quota and started adjusting cattle out there in the forest.
Like my grandfather was like he was a horseman. He wasn't a fisherman, and he didn't stay when he went the first time. I can sort of remember what he was doing, and like the first recollection, they were burning charcoal because they were only about 200 yards from the house down the back,
I was born in Carlton actually, but at that time we were living here, yeah.
And your father was a great charcoal burner.
He was, yeah.
Black Gold.
The old Black Gold Charcoal Company, yeah.
Yeah, Black Gold Charcoal Company, and you've taken on the mantle now.
Yeah. A fella used to burn charcoal by the name of Starchovich, and he burnt over the river from Barmah there. And I think they knew each other from the old country, and Dad saw him they actually had a fair bit to do with each other in Melbourne, and then old Starchovich moved up here. And then Dad separated from his first wife and that, and then bumped into old Starchovich. He goes, look, if you want a quiet life, come up here. He said, I'm burning charcoal. It's easy, not an easy job, he said, but it's a good, easy lifestyle. And anyway, that's how it sort of became, I think.
I'm nearly 100, I'm 90.
You're doing a great job.
90-something or other.
99.
My sister Jessie, she is 100. I didn't go to high school. Some of the family did. They'd get bored in Nathalia. We used to go yabbing too, and the dam on the forest fence was our fence. And that dam, there was a big dam, and we used to go yabbing in there, and that was all right. Pretty good, in fact. And there was all the hay making, and then we milked, I think it was 16 cows one year. Yes, they milked 6 and I milked 4. We could go out, to the forest and go out. I put the bait on a 56-pounder one time. So I reckon I sort of caught it. We were only, like in my home, we were only about, well, it's a mile it was, they called in those days, away from the creek.
I've been a public servant as a forester all my life, and I've worked for the Forest Commission up until the last 2 or 3 years when I worked for the Department of Conservation, Forests and Lands.
There were 18 sawmills in the forest, 3 to 4 trains per week operated from Pecola Station at the height of the Barmah Forest timber industry. Over 90% of the railway sleepers in use in Victoria are red gum. Many of these came from the Barmah Forest.
I was at Kahuna with my wife and family for 6 years. In 1966, I was posted to Nathalia, but it's the Barmah district. I had no say in it. I was just told by opening the mail one day, and I find that there I am, and it gave me 30 days to get there.
I got down there and I got they said, what are you doing there? And I said, I come for a job. And of course I got a job. And what can you do? Drive truck, you know. So I'd carted sleepers and I'd carted gravel from Yelka and gravel pits around there, and I never had a licence and no registration on the trucks.
Mike didn't want to go from Kahuna to Nathalia, and they were into high school, and him and his sister, and I can remember his mother, Mike's mother, encouraging him about going to Barmah, and she had heard or knew of what are called the wild horses in the Barmah Forest, and she told him, and she said, oh, you'll be able to go in the Barmah Forest and catch wild horses.
I got to Melbourne and I've spent 44 years there. Barmah came into it then in 1952. We cut a lot of logs there.
I worked there in the early 70s for a couple of years, and then in the late 70s I worked there for about 10 years till Dad got crook, and then I worked with him for 12 months till he passed away, and then I took over his licence. Cut sleepers for about 20 years.
I started working there early 80s with the old lands department. They were on 3 and 6 month contracts, mainly on weed work and wild pigs, trapping pigs. First year I trapped them out there, I got 75 in 6 weeks.
Just a few of us got together, a few friends, and we formed a group then called the Nathalia Wildflower Group. So we'd go out in the forest and perhaps for one of the meetings and collect well, you're not supposed to pick the native things, but we'd have to collect them for identification purposes.
I'm the last one there. Isn't it terrible? It's a very funny feeling to be the last, because there were so many there.
You married Darcy, of course, Darcy Maloney.
Yes.
And Darcy's a great sleeper cutter and timber worker. How did he first come to Barmah Forest?
Well, he lived at Lower Moira, and then they moved up, they bought a farm at Barmah.
Yeah.
And then when he left school, he worked on the farm for a while. Then he went on the Forest Commission, and then he got a sleeper's licence. So he worked in the bush from when he was 16.
When I was 17, I was working for Ernie Freeman, and he lived right on the edge of the Barmah Forest. And Len Burley was a sleeper cutter, and he cut sleepers for the exhibition in London. We had to roll them in Hessian and take them in and put them on the rail. Whether they ever got to England or not, I wouldn't know, but I know they left Nathalia. We spent 5 years there. We cut trees down that they couldn't handle with sleepers and that because there were no machines. But we cut a lot of big trees. Sometimes there'd be 3 or 4 loads to go to Melbourne. They're 10 to 12 tonne on the truck.
Red gum was far and away the major forest product. Some of the very best grew long and tall, and a lot of them were cut for the Melbourne Harbour Trust. by local contractors.
What do they use them for?
Well, wharves and piers and things like that, and so many of them are made of just red gum piles. There weren't many operators. There were probably only, in my time, only the one family, Swan Brothers. They used to cut piles, and and they were, the royalty was top royalty on those.
Well, our association goes back to the very early 1850s, in that our great-great-grandfather was the first European to settle permanently in the Barmah area, and he camped right on the edge of the forest and harvested ducks and fish, for the goldfields at Bendigo.
With a broad axe, it's not like something straight out in front of you. The handle is offset so that the whole length of the blade hits in the one place. It's not sheltered from your vision.
That when sleepers were cut in this way, there was no falling the tree with the chainsaw and sticking it out onto a landing. The tree was felled in the forest with the axe and the cross-cut saw, and the sleepers were cut on the spot.
How's the police got stopped anyway?
Hit them with the axe, and from the note they can tell whether it's a solid tree or not. Here we are breaking open now, and somebody carefully collects all the wedges so that an axe won't hit them later. This board, of course, gives you a bit of an idea of where your sleeper is going to fit in the log. The idea is to chop a score into the side of the billet into the line, something that's not real easy to do because the score has to be vertical. Now you can see Lee is using the broad axe there to square down that side. Now that's the side of the sleeper there as it will be finished. They've now got the two narrow sides of the sleeper, and they're about to square the other two sides. And the tree here. It's over. I didn't have the clock on him, but he's not far outside his 10 minutes. Kenny incidentally holds the record for the greatest number of sleepers cut in any 1 year, or supplied to the railways in any 1 year. I think it worked out at an average of 20 a day for the whole year.
Hard work. Hard work. No wonder they were wrecked, their backs and knees and everything, stumbling through the bush all the time.
From state school, it was, we need a hand to Murray, you better come out and drive the truck for us, or the train, or whatever. Yeah.
His main job was always been piles for the Harbour Trust and wharves. Logging, whatever.
No, the piles that go to Melbourne in their lengths?
Yeah,
for the wharves.
Yeah, they would receive an order for 200 at 45 foot with a certain size top, and then spend however long looking for that particular pile. And it worked a lot better if they had multiple orders, so that they could, bring in a range of different sizes.
So they all went down to Melbourne?
Yes.
To the wharf down there?
Yeah, Port Arlington, Geelong.
Warboss.
There were about 6 or 7 different spots seemed to be the main orders.
So, because the red gum lasted a long time in the water?
Yeah, it certainly did, yeah. Unfortunately, the qualities it had weren't recognised until, probably 20 years ago, when there was a fad for red gum furniture. Yeah. Well, it's always had those qualities, just no one really appreciated or weren't prepared to work with it to, get that result. Yeah, a glorious timber with its own natural colours. There's no need to stain it. First licence I had was in the very early 80s. That was mainly just trying to cut timber out of small diameter logs for the half barrels I made.
Railway sleepers.
The railway sleepers would be the main orders.
Hold it tight, and now he's marking the end where he's going to work his sleepers out of it. And his little measure and his chalk. Mark on the top corners, side along with the saw when he's ready to cut. Put a little nick in there with the broad axe.
small wedge of bark, put the wedge of bark in the cut so that you can see it from the other end of the log.
Their licence was simply a salvage licence, which meant they travelled throughout the forest picking up wind damaged or trees that had blown over in the wind, or from too much moisture at the bottom at the wrong time.
No, me and Jerry bought the first days. They didn't bother buying one with a blade on it because the bush was that open you could drive anywhere and pull up the truck beside your logs with the trucks and roll them on.
Oh, yeah.
And, horse and carts. Old Tom and them would just drive their horse and carts virtually anywhere through the bush.
Jack Clark used to drive a grader, and I was in charge of the Barmah district. I think there were about 6 or 7 districts in a division, and the whole division, I think, well, as far as we're concerned, they had one power grader that graded the tracks, made them passable, and we like to think that we did our best to do that, but with limited resources.
Freddie Elliott and Bill Pridmore used to do the falling, and Des and I were carting logs in that usually start the end of January after holidays. And
Fred completed his cut-off, and Bill was checking his record, writing it onto the end of the log, and the forest overseer will now come and check the log and make his allowances for fault, if any.
used to take about 6 to 8 weeks, pull them all into the mill there, and then they'd start the mill up and start cutting them. They had a crane that lifted onto a breaking down trolley, and that used to go through the breaking down saws, and then it'd go down skids down to the rip bench. And they'd cut house stumps, railway sleepers, palings, anything, a lot of red gum droppers, fencing, all that sort of stuff, and the scrap used to go onto firewood.
The old steamer days, the Murray River sawmill at Shire, used to cut logs on both sides of the river then, but the Barmah Forest always had landings along the river where they'd take the mill logs to the landing on the edge of the river, and they'd pull the barges up and roll the logs down into the water and tie them on.
And then the paddle steamers come up and go around the corner, and you could see them, and you could see the barges coming back down loaded right at time.
Latter years of the DSE, I was branding timber, or silvicultural work, grading logs.
As the forest overseer, who was branding a tree for the fallers to fall for a mill log, measuring round its girth, its breast height, and if it's a good tree like that with no faults, it needs to be at least 72 centimetres around the girth. He's going to now blaze it so that the fallers will know that it's one that they can fall. The blaze mark on the side of it. And we'll now put a toe mark, toe at the stump, into solid wood, and then he hammers it with his brand hammer.
Well, after the faller falls the logs are set for defect allowance, and you can see here we make allowance for fire burn and gum rings. See the gum rings there, and the logs are branded, and they're ready to cut.
We used to thin the trees out, but you had to let the trees get up in the air before you thinned them out. Otherwise, you get a tree like a cabbage or a cauliflower, and we were in the business of growing trees for timber. So the longer and taller they were, we used to call it thinning from below, cutting trees down for sleepers or for garden timber or fence posts. Cutting from above was cutting the mill logs down.
Get it around and then they'll pick this log up, put it on top of the other 3 that are already on the track.
We had to leave so many trees, two between 100 and 150 centimetres diameter per hectare, two between 50 and 100. If there were none in the higher classes, double the amount for recruitment up into the above. And then we were supposed to, under the silvicultural guidelines, take all the trees over, I think it was 50 centimetres for saw logs. You know, I always branded on the leaner side and didn't take everything that I could have taken, much to the disgust of some of the sawmillers. They used to say, "What's wrong with that tree?" And I'd say, "Oh, we'll get him next time." My father said to me years ago, he said, "While you've got that branding hammer in your hand, just remember you're always the boss."
Some of the trees are elite. The names of some of the old foresters who were, Tingate was one of them, Code was another one, and trees, and I don't know whether they're still standing in the Barmah Forest. Oh, yeah. They're super trees in that they're almost gun barrel straight, and they just go up and up. The foresters at the time recognised that these were not the norm. They gave them, memorialised them. Yeah, go by name.
The first recollection, they were burning charcoal, because they were only about 200 yards from the house down the back, you know.
Did he have kilns?
Yeah, they had, I don't know how many kilns. It seemed like a lot to me at the time, but he cut the wood, and he had a horse and a couple of draft horses and wagons, and they'd load it, bring it in, stack the kilns. And they liked working on that job in the winter time because it was like camp near the kilns, you know. Nice. Yeah.
So what did the charcoal go to then days?
It was wartime, and that was going for foundries and that sort of thing, you know. Well, my recollection would have been at the end of the war.
Yeah.
And he didn't stay long, you know.
Yeah.
And then the next recollection of him working was they had a big stack of wood at Picola, 6 foot lengths of wood. And they had a saw bench there, and they'd bench it up into foot blocks and put it on the truck and then into a railway truck and send it off to Melbourne. They'd stack it in the railway truck.
Can you just run us through the process of burning charcoal?
It's simple, but yeah, it has its little intricacies, I should say. Essentially, we've got steel kilns. They do it in pits, like Mallee charcoal and Gidgee charcoal and these sorts of places. They do it in pits where they dig a hole in the ground, bury the logs, slow combust, cover it up, and it'll burn for weeks. Where we're above ground with steel kilns, they used to be round old oil tanks. They used to use old oil tanks. You stack the wood in that, have a lid on it, just light it up. Once it's lit, you damp it down with sand and just have a few little draft pipes, and that just slowly lets the fire just tickle away to the point where the wood doesn't actually burn. It just goes black and just turns into a pure carbon, and that's what you want. In the above ground kilns like we do, it's probably only a 24-hour process. Back in the day, Dad would sell it to foundries for making railway line, and also a hell of a lot of restaurants, and that throughout Melbourne. I still do it like Dad does. It's all partially mechanised with front-end loaders and stuff now, but back in those days, everything was hand. Everything was by hand. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, during the floods, we'd be out there with a chainsaw. The chainsaw was probably your most modern piece of equipment, apart from your truck. You're cutting bits of wood off and using the crowbar and chisel and hammer to break off bits off a rotten log just to get it into the kilns.
The cattle grazing enabled the natural water flow in the forest to continue.
I grew up on the Barmah Forest. Mustard cattle when I was 12 on the top end of the Barmah Forest. There was 3 lots of yards then in those days. There was Manions, Cherry Tree and Barmah. With my father, we mustered together in the top end at 1 year when I was 12. Probably done it 2 years.
Cattle grazing was within a defined area in the forest. It wasn't the whole forest, but it was in a substantial part of the district was a large territorial area. There weren't red gum trees on a lot of it. And there weren't only red gum trees in the timbered part.
How many cattle were you mustering in those days, Dave?
Up to about 4,500, 5,000, yeah. But that had dropped back to, 1,800, 2,000 if it was a bit drier or less.
Yeah. How many landowners were involved roughly, you reckon?
I think it was 70, wasn't there, at a stage?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, upwards of the 70, I think, came from memory, in earlier days. Yeah.
So everyone used to call it the common?
Yeah, that's right.
The Barmah Forest was the common.
Yeah, and back then it was really important, especially in the early years, for, be pre-irrigation. It was a green patch to take cattle to, or horses.
My parents, grandparents, were in the forest, in Barmah Forest, as managers before the Forest Commission took it over. Peggy, as they all called him, before the war, he had medals for being the best musterer and that on that, and he used to be out there for at least a fortnight. And even though he'd lost his leg up about here somewhere, he still used to go to the musters and go on the sorting gates, because he knew all the brands and everything like that, and that's again further back than Stitch Pierce. He'd go down and stay there while Barmah and Cherry Tree were there and camp with the blokes. And
I suppose when I was about 9 or 10, and then became part of the pony club here, and I can remember going down to the muster with Teddy Corrie. Yeah, I started mustering there probably in 67, really, 66, 67. And through until 1982, I didn't go back after 82. But in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a real good thing. When I started, there was 14 musterers, and there was very few other people went along. And there might have been 2 or 3 other riders that would go along, and that's all there was. And Tom Galloway was the herdsman in those days, and he was a great bloke. Old Tom. Back in those days, I know in the early 70s, they were mustering over 3,000 head of cattle, 3,300 head of cattle, I think, in 72, 3, 4. And then as time went by, that went on for quite a while. As time went by, the forest sort of began to grow less feed. And when they finished up, 10 years ago, I suppose they were only putting about 1,200 head out there.
The Forest Commission paid the musterers, 14 musterers, and then when Stitcher Pierce got crook about 1984 or 5, he was paid as the cook, and the boundary rider, his job was to go around the fence and make sure the fence was intact daily or twice daily. So there was 13 musterers and Stitcher.
My grandfather, Stitcher Pierce.
Towards the end, Stitch cooked for them. He said to me, make some scones and have them out there when the men come in from the ride. So I made some scones, but I'd be gone when they'd come.
There was about 14 paid musterers. Stitchy was the cook, he was paid. And then as far as I can remember, there was about 4 or 5 of us apprentices, I call us. That was when I first started. I was in Calvin Tricky's group. It's Calvin and myself and Stewie, Marlene Moore, another girl from down Lang Lang, 2 or 3 guys from Shep, old Mick Cole, There's usually about 8 or 9 of us. We just spread out so we could see each other. Yeah. You wouldn't be able to see each other now, it's that thick with suckers. Old Bags was there, Bags Hutchins. They always had dogs, and a couple of others, old Vic James. They were good, they didn't have to go chasing cattle, they just sent the dogs out. Whereas we had to go in the bush and do it the hard way. It was hard work, but it was good fun. Just gets in your blood and you can't help it. I've got 2 sons that came out with me, and they're still helping run the show, you know, what we've got now, Team Penny and two-handed cutting and the dances and that. I was on the dance committee for years and run the bar for years, and I enjoyed that. I just did it because I loved it.
So I went with old Teddy Walsh, and you know, as far as musterers go, there probably wasn't many better than knowing the forest, like he knew it, and a very good horseman, and had terrific dogs and that. And yeah, I learned a lot off old Ted. He was one of the great old musterers that I rode with. Nug Tricky was another one. He was very good bushman. There were some lean times actually back in the late 80s, and I can remember we only had 400 cattle out in the forest one year, and about 91 I think it was. It was very dry, so you know it was mainly governed on the season conditions sort of thing. And
how many cattle did you have out there?
Back then you were limited. I think it was 10. You started off with 10, and yeah, you built up as the years went on. You tried to build your quota up. That was all governed by the season conditions of the season and that, and how many cattle went on, sort of thing. So yeah, they tried to build the small owners up over a period of time. I think I got up to about 70 or 80 cattle by 207 or so when the muster ended, when they stopped putting cattle out there.
Something that a lot of people don't realise, that 90% of the Barmah Forest actually goes underwater and can go underwater for 3 or 4 months at a time. And the bird life and snakes and reptiles and frogs, if you ever want to hear frogs, go out when the flood's up. It is just absolutely fantastic.
The part of the forest I really enjoyed the best was going out in the boat in the floodwater, whether it be shifting cattle or that were stranded, or monitoring the bird breeding and the vegetation. And I know I was remotely attached to a trial that Cyro did on the giant rush. The only thing I know it's any good for is ibis to build their nests out of. I did see 3 brolgas out there. And they used to flatten it down and build a nest in it.
The Barmah Forest is the last known nesting site of the superb parrot in Victoria, and Peter Hawkey was the instigator of starting the Superb Parrot project up, which was to implement and revegetate its natural habitat and feed source. And he canvassed around to see if there was enough interest in the farmers to use their ground, as well as planting some trees on roadsides or whatever, and mainly to enhance the remnant vegetation that was there. He wanted to link everything up and put flight paths in for them. And so there was enough interest around, and they started off planting 1,000 or 2,000 plants a year, and it was all done by tube stock. Counted the birds every year and roughly see how the works were being, if the works were being successful or not. We did start noticing that the superb parrots were using the plantations, they were feeding in them and also using them as flight paths, and the birds did start to improve in numbers.
Best spot for yabbies we found was Harbours, the dam at Harbours. That's going back in the 80s, we did that mostly. And but there's that many, there weren't a lot of people sort of fished them much in those days. Now everybody's after them.
Fair few emus coming up that way now. And the odd koala. They really took off and adapted pretty well to the red gums there, yeah. They introduced them to Yalupra Island, didn't they? They bought them one of the droughts, I think might have been 67 or something, when it was a fairly dry year.
Barmah Island was the source of a lot of the anti-venin that was prepared in the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories.
Look, the local people were extremely generous and friendly, and I got married up there, and my wife was a became a school teacher at the local high school, and we have very many pleasant memories of our time in Barmah Forest District.
Dad was a professional fisherman. Of course, it was the Murray's New South waters. He had his nets, he made his nets, all his nets, wing drum nets, yeah. And he used suckers for the pegs that held the drum necks in place.
Used to be a crew of us always go out duck opening. Dad and Nug Tricky and Jack Tricky and Ernie Tricky all started together after the war. And they were going for 50 years, I think. Never missed a duck opening, and it grew to a mob of about 25 or 30 of us from their children and their mates and a few cousins. And
Joe Rice. Well, old Waldo Rice, I think he was the first one in Barmah. He's buried at Barmah. Old Joe, he was Mrs. Lawford's, Mrs. Duncan. Now, Duncan Lawford was a funny man.
Yeah.
They used to call him Dumb.
Oh, yeah, no.
Old Dumb, Lawford.
Yeah, no.
He was a character. See, Dash, he was a shearer too. Yes. He and Louis both used to go shearing when the floods were up and so forth.
Well, see, that's interesting because, see, when you had the floods, you're out of work as a sleeper cutter.
No, there was no work sometimes for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, so you had to do something, didn't you?
Yeah.
So
yes.
they went shearing and...
Yeah, they used to go shearing.
So I've met some great people over my time. Alfie Swan is one that sticks out. Real character. And probably Pussy McCann, Kenny McCann, they both cut sleepers together, and I don't know whether they ever spoke 2 words in probably the 40 years they worked together. That good day in the morning, good night at night, and never speak all day while they were working together. Yeah, real characters.
There was a little village out at Gowers Gate, that's how it got its name. The family of Gowers lived there. 4 daughters, I'm not sure how many sons, but 4 daughters married local fellas. 2 of them, or 3 of them were sleeper cutters.
Where he's going to work his sleepers out of it. Off the corner that it didn't cut out with the sword, it drew it up. Bagged his slab out of the way and now he rolls out first sleeper.
When the Second World War started, the government housed the aliens or internees, Italian prisoners of war, there, and Tom Galloway, who was the herdsman out in the Barmah Forest, was the warden or guardian or prison officer or whatever, and he used to supervise these internees who mainly burnt charcoal to provide for their sustenance and keep. There's still remnants of the old village that was out there. There was a series of huts, one of which was taken to the Barmah muster yards. Another one was put on a sledge and snigged out to what we call the Black Stump. Tom Galloway had that as a hut that he camped in during flood time, and 2 of the other huts I know were taken up to Thistlebed and used by different Forest Commission staff, Lands Department staff for work in the forest. They were there until the 70s. I had the good fortune to camp at them with Tom Galloway in the mid-60s when we moved there.
I was a maternal and child nurse, and you get notifications of births.
Yes.
And some of the Aboriginal people lived on this side of the river, and the Barmah people, they usually used to go to Echuca there was a lady in the Nathalia hospital who had a baby, and her husband was a criminal. He was on the run from the law. So he dumped her in the hospital because she's about to have the baby, and then he nipped out to the forest and tried to hide himself. So she was discharged. So there was a bit of an uproar then. So the maternal and child nurse had to go out and see she was all right, but here's this criminal waving a gun round. So they gave me Tom Galloway came with me. I have been offered a police escort for other clients.
Doc Harvey was an absolute legend in Nathalia as a doctor, but he also loved his fishing and shooting. He wasn't much good at fishing, I must admit. He'd have 4 rods in the water and there'd be fish going on each one, but he'd never catch any. But Dad only, and he'd be smoking his pipe and listening to the radio or something. But, so he was an absolute legend, and I don't know how long he was in Nathalia for as a doctor, but he was here for virtually ever and a day. He birthed, along with my mum and that, they birthed nearly all of Nathalia at one stage.
And it was the last 3 months. Mr. and Mrs. Les Freeman. They used to have the mail. Mrs. Broad from Nathalia used to take she had a horse and gig. Yeah. She'd take the mail out to Sleeman's and you'd go there and collect yours if you had any. There was a station at Bacola. You could go from Bacola to Nathalia, I think. And then you could go to Newmarket. One of my sisters was at Newmarket. I went and stayed out there and then caught the train on the Saturday and went out to Strathmerton and met my group there. They were playing tennis. I used to play tennis quite a lot. Wouldn't mind a good game of tennis now if you want. I remember walking, and then I remember Ian, my brother, giving me a piggyback some of the way home. It was 2 miles, you know. It was a long way for a little kid. But I did love riding the horse.
The good local citizens of Barmah area had been complaining for some time to the Forest Commission about the way the Commission's attitude was to cattle grazing in the Barmah Forest. And the local people were adamant that under the system of management that the cattle were doing no significant harm, and the Commission, on its advice from its officers, was of the opinion that the cattle were detrimental to the establishment of red gum. One needs to go back to the institutions that were managing Victoria's lands. They were commissions, those institutions, like the State Electricity Commission, the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission, and the commissioners had a very sound technical knowledge of what they were managing.
I was the district forester in charge of the district. I worked for the Forest Commission at that stage. There were a number of forest overseers who were supervisory personnel who, within the district area, had an allocated territory which they supervised: timber cutters, sleeper cutters, sawmill, saw logs.
From the early 1980s, there was a radical change in the governance of land management, and those commissions were dismantled, and the premiers of the day appointed secretaries to manage these departments, and the secretaries didn't necessarily have any technical knowledge. I was accepted in good faith after about 18 months or so, and Tom Galloway, who was the herdsman of the time, he and I developed a very strong relationship, and he knew the bush extremely well. And the Trickies, I recall, much to my amazement in later days, lent me an original edition of Kerr's Squatting in Victoria, published in 1863 by the Robertson Publishing Company, and I was too frightened to read it without wearing gloves. Actually, I recognised it was a book of great significance. Experiment with aerial seeding of eucalypt seed in Victoria was actually carried out in the Barmah Forest in the autumn of 1966. That was interesting and proved successful. I had the cooperation of the locals and the sleeper cutters and the sawmillers in doing that, for which I'm very grateful. I think a great deal more needs to be done in the water management planning. There was a very significant event in the early 1990s, and that the government engaged consultants to prepare a water management plan for the Barmah Millewa Forest. It was strongly supported by the Murray-Darling Basin Ministerial Council and the governments, and they produced a plan for the water management of the forest. That plan has been modified since then, but a lot of scientists nowadays do everything by modelling, and they tend to believe what comes out of the computer as the gospel. But you need to verify what the models are telling you on the ground to performance against prescription, I call it, and that generally is not being done as effectively as it was. And then the government set up the Victorian Environment Assessment Council to look at the Murray Valley area and the Red Gum Forest. And I just show people this book. It's called Conservation and Community, and it was prepared on behalf of the Rivers and Red Gum Environmental Alliance. Over 34 organisations involved in that alliance, and they put forward one of the best cases I have ever seen on the common sense balance between preservation and conservation and wise use, sustainable use of the resource.
I'm currently president of the Barmah Forest Preservation League. I guess my thoughts go back to the first time I heard about the Barmah Forest Heritage and Education Centre was off Stanvale around 1982 when the Barmah Forest Preservation League was first formed. He mentioned to me that we needed something to tell the history and story of the Barmah Forest and to try and educate people on what the Barmah Forest was about and how it needed to be managed and looked after and what it could offer the community.
In 2009, the Victorian Environment Assessment Committee declared the Barmah Forest as the Barmah National Park. Significantly, timber harvesting ended with the declaration and grazing phased out. The following opinions and recollections are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent the opinion of Moira Shire.
In the earlier years, I probably didn't appreciate quality, but certainly in later life, you could see the quality, and you could also see that there's some decline in the quality too in later years.
Well, for example, the duck holes used to be marvellous for cattle feed and that, and plains and that, and yeah, they've put water over it at the wrong time in the heat and that sort of thing. They've killed all the Moira grass off, my belief, through all that. Saplings that Gowers track, you would have remembered when you just drive straight up there, you flat out riding a horse along it, there's that many saplings over.
In later times now I notice there's a lot more saplings growing than what there was in my time. It was a little bit more open.
A lot more trees there than there used to be. Probably the flood regime, but a lot of the time the water's gone into the forest at the wrong time, and the water holes where we used to shoot, we used to walk into them, they'd be solid this floor, now they're all silted up, reeded over. Bird life's all gone. Probably the biggest change I've seen is out on Moore Plain. Used to be 300 or 400 acres just open Moira grass, and now that's all that water running there in summer, where it usually naturally dry out.
Now you'd be the last of the charcoal burners in the Barmah Forest?
I'm the end, yeah.
Yeah, you're the one and only.
On the end, yeah. Not many people want to get dirty. We've got enough market for probably 5,000 bags a season, which is not a hell of a lot, but it's something.
The change from when I started riding in 85 to then was just unbelievable. It was, big plains, Moira grass plains when I first went out there, and by the time we'd finished, it was, there was reed beds and suckers everywhere sort of thing, and it was it was always, you know, it was at the end of the day, it was put down to flooding the forest too much in the summer.
Our age group's seen the best of it. Ones before us had to go out there on horseback. We had the luxury of a car, and maybe the next generation, I don't know what they'll see.
Hope that they keep the forest there for us to go out and have a fish on the river or whatever sort of thing. So go for a ride on the horse sort of things.
The next generation, I think, it'd be to have an open mind about things, especially with like things like a timber industry, like a forest. Like there's such thing as conservation, rather than being too aggressive in locking things up, trying to protect it. But all you're going to do in the end is damage it more. Where everybody can live, everybody could utilise the forest and enjoy it like they have over the years. Properly managed can be there for everybody and forever.
I do believe Jimmy's right. If you pull the logs into the side of the river, it would still create habitat for the fish, and it would protect the bank so much more. But they do run the river up and down now like they never used to. What would you say to the next generation of people that want to go out and see the Barmah Forest?
You better go with us or you get lost.
Anybody that's in the timber, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, that's your link to each other.
I just think it's the best place ever. It's my psychiatrist. If I go over that levee bank into the Barmah Forest, everything just peels away. Once you've been a bushman, I don't think you can get it out of your blood. So I owe my love of the bush probably to my dad, who was a great bird watcher, and his love of the bush. I can remember coming out of the forest one day, and we'd been fishing out there and got a sugar bag full of fish, and we hadn't seen a soul all day, and we're driving out. I said, "How come nobody knows about this place, Dad? It's got to be the best place on earth." And he said, "We don't tell anyone."
I talk to others that have been out there, those that have been fortunate enough to work out there that know it, but treat it better than your own backyard.